Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast. This week we're again talking to a flared user from the subreddit, in this case the Governor. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And we are specifically talking about two things really, which are more broadly the Governor's field, which is historical archaeology, and more specifically the Camino Real in the Colonial Andes. So, welcome.
Yeah, like I said, great to be here. Awesome opportunity to hopefully get a little exposure for my sub disciplines as they go down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can start big and go small. So, in big terms, what actually is historical archaeology as a field? What differs it from normal history, so to speak, and why isn't it just plain old archaeology?
You may have opened a larger can of worms with the initial question than you thought, because there's sort of two working definitions. One of which, the more general, is that historical archaeology is text-aided archaeology, that it's archaeology, meaning the analysis of material culture to understand the human past, done with the additional information derived from historical documents, broadly understood. But when you talk to people and you go to historical archaeology conferences, and when I or someone introduces themselves as a historical archaeologist, that's generally not what they mean. They don't mean I just use text. Typically, people mean it something like this. Is James Dietz's definition, who's sort of one of the founders of the field, was that it's the archaeology of the spread of European cultures throughout the world since the 15th century or thereabouts, and their impact on and interaction with the cultures of indigenous peoples. That's from In Small Things Forgotten, which is sort of one of the foundational texts of the field. That's what people generally mean, because to say that you were a historical archaeologist in the general sense would include things like classical archaeology, like biblical archaeology. You would even include, the Maya, who are very obviously a literate society, and we understand their glyphs now. But people don't say that they're a historical archaeologist when they study the classic Maya. And so that's very much the definition that I fall into, is this idea of the study of colonialism, of capitalism, of a very popular definition now has also been sort of the archaeology of the modern world. How did we come to be where we are in the last 500 years or so? And so that's typically when people self-identify as historical archaeologists, that's typically what they're talking about.
It's sort of an interesting definition, isn't it? The idea of kind of, history begins 1500-ish in a way for the purposes of historical archaeology. But
right.
It's the archaeology of periods that we normally, I guess, associate purely with the documentary.
Right. And it has been critiqued from various angles, one of which is the inherent sort of Eurocentrism of that starting point, that, Columbus, depending on how you view it, it isn't necessarily a radical departure from any other instance of cultural contact. It's just what we have typically considered the new and old worlds, but that's just a matter of perspective. But the larger issue, I think, is that is a starting point for sort of modern processes that we're still dealing with, things like globalization. So one of the inherent issues in historical archaeology is questions of scale, and how do you deal with things like capitalism or colonialism, or these really broad sort of structural historical things going on with archaeology, which is really, objects in the ground and sites and collections of sites. It's that, I think, is its unique staying power, and it's what interests me in the field.
Yeah. And with that in mind, there's obviously a bit of an interesting situation when you're dealing simultaneously with the archaeological evidence, which is presumably the hard stuff that is what seems to be the principal focus of historical archaeologists, with the considerable documentary evidence as well. I mean, to what extent is this a discipline which aims to augment the documentary record with archaeological evidence, and to what extent is it actually the reverse, that it is a field of archaeology that is heavily informed by the documentary?
Yeah, there's a couple of phases to that, if you like. At the beginning, um, you could even go back to like Schliemann's excavations at Troy and say, that is an attempt to either confirm or deny the documentary record, or confirm something of the documentary record with archaeological evidence. Moving a little bit past that, you get things, and again, I should have, I guess, said this at the beginning. Anthropology, archaeology, and history have very different relationships to each other depending on where you are in the world. In England, people might identify themselves as post-medieval archaeologists, for example, rather than historical. I come from the American sort of archaeology as anthropology, one of the four fields of anthropology approach, and I've been trained in that tradition. So if that may color this answer slightly. But there's periods sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, you see similar things at places that are sort of foundational to the American identity. To use an example I'm most familiar with, places like Jamestown or Colonial Williamsburg, you have this desire to identify specific places. One of the first excavations at Jamestown was designed to identify the church and the meeting of the Jamestown Assembly. As this sort of monumental birthplace of Americanness. That changes a little bit in the 1960s, 1970s. You see processual archaeology coming into American archaeology more broadly, which is this idea of doing archaeology like science with a capital S, I think is a great way of putting it, as hypothesis testing. And historical archaeology sort of jumps on that bandwagon a bit. And says, well, if the historical document is the hypothesis, can we confirm or deny, and can we provide quantifiable evidence that will, I think that the hidden implication there is cut through the bias of the documents. The document is always going to have a certain perspective, but the archaeology will be, if it's science with a capital S, it will produce truth with a capital T. Later in the sort of 80s, 90s, and I would very much consider myself, as a sort of modern student, a continuation of this phase, is processual archaeology gets challenged by people who are concerned with power and with perspective, and saying, are we really finding that truth with a capital T, just in numbers? Can you quantify your way out of bias? And I think we've reached an even more productive stage now of engaging with historical documents where it's not a question of, is this document true or not? It's, this document is someone's truth. It is their memory, their lived experience to them. And archaeology can provide another perspective, another lens. It in many ways can sometimes speak for those groups of people left out of the documentary record. And if you combine the two, this is something that's come up in my own research, the documentary record, again, being often a sort of elite perspective. If you think about who's literate in the time period, the sort of colonial period, with my work specifically, you get, what does that person see? And then what does archaeology tell us about what they either don't see, or what do they see and not write down? So you get a much fuller perspective by combining the two without sort of trying to put them in opposition to each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think one thing, which is a slight digression, I suppose, but one thing you brought up reminded me of a conversation I had a while ago with a secondary school student. And, I mean, there's a kind of an idea in some ways that archaeology is, in and of itself, a perfect unbiased source. That stuff that you find is just there. But, I mean, of course, even what survives is very uneven. I mean, wood rots, stone doesn't, for instance. Right. But I was wondering, especially with historical archaeology, especially because it works in such recent periods, comparatively speaking, given that my background verges slightly on classical archaeology, just for context, how much do you also have to deal with the incompleteness of the archaeological record, and not just incompleteness, but indeed sort of a biased, disproportionate incompleteness?
Quite a bit is the answer. Depending on where in the, because I obviously have sort of posited 1492 as the start date of historical archaeology, but it runs all the way up to the present. I think you could consider things like the Garbology project, the sort of study of the contemporary through material culture, as being part of historical archaeology, or at least informed a lot by the same sort of theory. And so it depends where and when you're talking about in that period. There is, I can put on my prehistorical sort of archaeology, geoarchaeology hat and say things like it depends on the acidity of the soil, depends on the moisture content, it depends on whether you're talking about metal objects or wood or ceramics, in that sort of context of formation process. But the other context is, as you move ever closer toward sort of the contemporary age, people start to do different things with their trash. If a lot of prehistoric archaeology is either targeted at middens, assuming that people threw everything in together, or sort of assumes that the bits and pieces that you pick up embedded in a floor surface are where they fell and sort of got trampled in. But if you're doing the archaeology of a 19th century industrial mill village, for example, you can't assume that what you find in the back garden, which may be, food remains, not compost, but that sort of perishable material, is representative of the material culture as a whole. If people threw sort of kitchen detritus out the window, but they did something else with bottle glass, what you're digging in a square foot, and often, if you might be digging in a house that's now quite a chic townhouse, and they're happy to let you dig in the garden, but you can't unearth their foundations. That's part of the selection process too. You do have to be careful that you don't interpret what you find in the ground, even from very recent sites, as representative of their material assemblage as a whole.
Yeah. And I guess with that now in mind, with us having talked a little bit about the methodology, I mean, you've said a few times, it depends when and where, so, well, let's talk about the when and where. Because your thing, as you've described to me, is your research is on the Camino Real, which is in the Colonial Andes. Just as a very basic overview, what was it, and indeed, what is it?
So I'll have to dip back into prehistory a bit for context. But so the Spanish come in and colonize or invade South America in the early 16th century. They build up this large-scale economy of lots of different things. There's farming going on, but one thing people latch onto is colonial mining, because it's both very emblematic of the sort of colonial exploitation. We see images of forced or coerced labor in places like the mines at Potosi, and also because we have a pretty good documentary record of things like silver mining, for obvious reasons, because it's worth a lot compared to maybe other aspects of the colonial economy. So the road that I'm interested in, Camino Real, gets tossed around a little bit, as we're not quite sure what it means. And there may be roads that have that sort of royal highway title that are built slightly differently. But the one I'd looked at specifically was originally built to connect the seaports on the Pacific, Lima, with the mines at Potosi, the silver mines, and the mercury mines at Huancavelica as well, sort of in this very extractive, efficient system. Later in the 18th century, that shifts slightly, and Potosi silver starts to flow out towards the Atlantic. And that obviously is a long period of colonial history. They're also, at least on the western side, I think, built on top of Inca roads, so that you have to push back even further there. It's a really long span. But it's essentially this really long road that connects Potosi and mining communities and other places in the Central Andes with ports on the coast, which is what the Spanish are interested in. They're interested in getting stuff out, extracting wealth from this colony. So,
yeah. And I guess to start us off with, because you do mention the Inca roads here, and I just wanted to sort of start as early chronologically as possible. Was was it a particularly conscious decision to make use of existing Incan Andean roads, in the sense that, oh, these are routes that are already logically the best ones to use, or um, what does the use of those roads reflect really on the part of Spanish colonial administration?
I think there's a few things. I think one, moving through, as anyone who's been, and by the way, when I say that the Inca is sort of the earliest chronologically that I deal with, there are, I'm sure, other Andeanists on the subreddit who are like head in their hands. And he's like, what about Wari? And what about the late intermediate period? And you can go as far back as you like. But I just deal with that sort of to focus on empires and the state. It's kind of what I deal with as an archaeologist. But to get back to the original question, sorry. Inca roads are, in one sense, probably the best route through the Andes. As anybody who's visited knows, it's a really hostile environment to move through. If you've done, for example, the hike up to Machu Picchu, it's taxing. So there's that, but I think now we're seeing archaeological evidence that in some cases the Inca roads may not be built in what is the best route in engineering terms from that sort of perspective. In some cases, for certain communities, they may have even intentionally be built to be demanding of labor. It's a way of keeping people busy so they don't rebel. It's to keep them involved in sort of state infrastructure projects. So that's the Inca perspective. But I think when the Spanish get there, it's both that the roads already exist, but it's also that those support networks already exist. They can sort of co-opt this system of state labor tax, which becomes the famously exploitative Spanish mita, which, again, kills a huge number of people in mining and related industries. But even as far as the roads, the lodging alongside them, there's this sort of network of local labor to support it and maintain it already there that the Spanish, in many cases, try to co-opt, and in many cases are not entirely successful in co-opting because they don't really understand the reciprocal sort of give and take that exists there before they get there.
Yeah, and obviously, the road gets established. One thing, and to be fair, you gave me a list of points to have a look through, and to be fair, my chronology of this period is virtually non-existent. And one thing you noted is that the creation of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata had a significant impact on the Potosi silver trade. Unfortunately, I kind of only know what some of these words mean,
Right.
so you may have to explain both to me and the audience.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we get to the 18th century, the Bourbon reforms. The Spanish crown is in trouble economically. They're trying to sort of right the ship, and again, thinking chronologically, you have to imagine that we're several generations, several centuries, in fact, post contact here. So you have families in, say, Lima, for example, it's this big trading port, who are really well established. They've been doing this for a long time. They have contacts. They sort of have worked out the most efficient way to do this. In many cases, they've also, it seems, worked out how to skim off the top and sort of take silver out of circulation before it gets to a tax collector. In some ways, the road to Buenos Aires down the eastern side toward the Atlantic may have also been an early smuggling route. It is possible in that sort of early 16th, 17th century period, but it gets sort of codified with the creation of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. You see the road sort of become an official known road, and the trade becomes legitimate, right? So you have a decline in power of some of these Lima trading families, monopolies, mercantile organizations, and a rising sort of new class, which is what some of my research deals with, of these opportunistic merchants who are prepared to travel on this new quote unquote road. and sort of make their best go of it, buy low, sell high, and exploit the more broad political changes of things like the Bourbon reforms.
Hmm. And I think to go in a little deeper, haha, where does the archaeology come into this aspect?
It's quite disparate. Let's put it that way. There hasn't been a huge sort of centralized survey. We get bits and pieces of, as the road passes through this valley. Even I should say bits and pieces. You're talking about people's dissertations that took years and thousands of hours of labor. So they're incredible pieces of research, but even that is a dot here and there when you look at the scale of the South American continent. But so jumping back to my research in particular, we have this late 18th century document, El Lazarillo de Ciegos Caminantes, which is this sort of it's satire, it's colonial commentary, but it's also a record of this journey from Buenos Aires to Lima up and over the mountains on this road. And sort of to get back to what I was talking to at the beginning of the episode, it's a very elite perspective. It's a literate, upper class guy who's commenting on his travels. He's traveling very comfortably. He's staying in relatively comfortable overnight lodgings. So I took that as my point of departure, and then looking at the bits and pieces of colonial roadside archaeology that you can find throughout the region, I said, how does it reflect what this guy says, but also where does it differ, right? And that, again, getting back to this idea of different perspectives not necessarily having to be in opposition to each other, but being able to tell a more full story. And one of the things I saw, maybe jumping ahead again now, so you'll have to backtrack me, but is that the local ephemeral sort of windbreak sites that common laborers probably used to stay in and move along these roads, these systems that have deep Andean precedent in sort of pastoral tradition, you see them archaeologically, but you never see them mentioned in the documentary sources. You see a much larger focus on an institution called the Posta, which is sort of an overnight lodging house and also a center for trade and the Royal Mail, as the name sort of implies. You see that pop up in the documents. You don't see these sort of campsites scattered throughout the landscape. And that's what really interested me in this research.
In terms of this infrastructure, what specific things, I suppose, are you looking for? Are we looking mostly at surviving buildings? Are we looking at sort of individual portable objects? Is it both?
Yeah, we get this prototypical idea of the posta, which is this sort of 18th century roadside lodging site. Maybe it has a central plaza and a couple of wings, bedrooms and a kitchen with a hearth, and comfortable bedrooms that keep you sheltered from what's often a hostile climate in the Andes and also on the sort of grasslands on the east side going down towards the Atlantic. That is the prototype. I've found in looking archaeologically all over Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, a few of those surviving as museums, but it wasn't clear to me how sort of reconstructed they were or not. And I found one of them that had been excavated archaeologically. One site that sort of fit that prototype. What I found a lot more of were things that maybe sort of kind of fit that ideal, and sites that don't really fit that ideal, that aren't built that way architecturally at all. Again, those sort of ephemeral campsites, they're called pescanas. This sort of built on a system that like llama herders use for a long time. And so again, it's this idea of, well, there's in the documents, we see this idealized vision of what roadside infrastructure should be or could be, perhaps if the Spanish crown invested in it heavily. And then on the ground, archaeologically, we see a much more complicated picture, a much more diverse range of structures, of material culture. You see everything from at that one site, it's called Pahatambo, that was archaeologically examined. You see high class things like boot spurs for a mounted rider. You see like the clasp that would hold large cargo trunks together. And then you see common red, earthenwares local to the area that have been in use for a millennium, more or less, as just common household objects. So again, both the architecture and then if you look even closer at individual artifacts, the documentary record doesn't mention a lot about common earthenwares. It talks about porcelain. It mentions quite often alcohol is something that pops up. So you expect to see things like bottle glass, but you don't get the sort of day-to-day cooking and eating and the common labor that goes into making the system work.
So with that in mind, with the idea that we find a lot of different objects of quite varying ranges of origin, of I suppose fineness in terms of quality. How does this reflect then what we know of movement along the road from the documentary evidence, and then, well, which, as you said, maybe not much, but also what does this now tell us that we can make use of?
So this was one of the sort of central points of my master's thesis was, what does it say? I think it says that you have different groups of people moving along the same road. You have wealthy merchants, you have laborers, you have foremen, which some of the documentary sources indicate those sort of fall along ethnic lines, that wealthy Peninsular and Creole Spaniards sort of move in one way, and they have common laborers who sort of move a lot of stuff. A lot of those folks may be of indigenous descent, and then at least from the documentary sources, you get a vision of these foremen who may often be mestizo or mixed race individuals, because we have accounts of them translating from Spanish to indigenous languages and back, and sort of describing how they're uniquely suited to that position for that reason. So you have those people. You have enslaved Black Africans. You have women and children who don't often pop up in the documentary record at all, and for that reason are even harder to pick out archaeologically. You have all these different groups of people moving across the road, but only one group of people, that elite documentary producing sector of society, have sort of control over the creation of state infrastructure, right? And have a voice to petition the crown for, we need a station here and a station there. And, you need to change the spacing on the lodging on this section of the road because it's really arduous. They have agency that way. On the other hand, when you start to look at the archaeological picture and go back to the documentary record, I found this really sort of tangential mention of a strike just outside of sort of Oruro area, Bolivia, by those indigenous laborers who were moving a lot of the goods, and who wouldn't pass through a certain town at a certain time of day because the local Spanish official was cruel and unjust and extractive of a lot of tax and would steal their animals. And the list of colonial abuses you could list for quite some time. Then you jump back to the archaeology and you start to see these little ephemeral campsites pop up, and in jumping back and forth, you start to think, well, what if these campsites are not just a windbreak and a way to get out of the cold for a little while and have a campfire? What if they're a way of exercising agency by people who don't have another voice? What if creating their own system of infrastructure, or at least of lodging, moving along the same road, they're exercising their will and the way they want to move and stop along this road? And so that was, I think, the big picture that I got out of juxtaposing back and forth this documentary and archaeological lines of evidence, was that you have one road that sort of links the landscape, but you have different groups of people having sort of separate qualitative experiences of moving alongside it, different lived experiences even united on this, same stretch of highway.
Huh. I mean, that seems like a very poignant sort of point to make. And I mean, is there anything you'd like to cover that we haven't already?
No, I think, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I've been succinct, and if not, they can take some of my rambling out in the edit,
No.
leaving just enough for me to be coherent.
No worries.
But yeah.
Yes, well, thanks for coming on then, and, well, we may see you again another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to checking out more of the podcast, and best of luck with your future interviews. You said you got a few of them coming up, so...
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.